Welcome to our panel discussion, When Home is a Dangerous Place, Breonna Taylor and American Domestic Terror. In this webinar, we will explore how people of faith can cultivate a theology of liberation when home is not a safe place. We wish to thank Union Presbyterian Seminary, the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership for sponsoring today's forum. A few notes before we start. You are on mute by default. Only panelists will be speaking during the session. Use the chat feature to ask questions. Panelists will review them before being displayed publicly. This webinar is being recorded. We will share the link soon so you can watch it again or share with others. Our panelists tonight are Reverend Dr. Michael Brandon McCormick, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. Hannah Drake, author, poet, spoken word artist, blogger, storyteller, speaker, and activist. Dana Purdom, founder of Breaking Fast with Minister Dana, spiritual entrepreneur, and womanist scholar and student at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Rodney Sadler Jr., Associate Professor of Bible and Director of the Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. And our host and moderator is Reverend Melanie C. Jones, Instructor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture, and Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Reverend Jones, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to the Just Talk, Talk Just series, co-sponsored by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Again, tonight's conversation is entitled, When Home is a Dangerous Place, Breonna Taylor and American Domestic Terror. I want to bring some context to our conversation tonight before we engage our panelists. Exactly 7 months to date, on March 13, 2020, at the height of the pandemic, the White House released the proclamation declaring a national emergency concerning a novel coronavirus disease outbreak, with more than 1,645 people infected in 47 states then. For many, March 13th was a day of reckoning, that a national shutdown could no longer be evaded as stay-at-home orders loomed from federal, state, and local governance. For Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old African-American millennial woman, March 13th marked a fatal ending as Louisville police barged into her home under a no-knock warrant and fired several rounds that resulted in her untimely death. Breonna was shot 8 times and killed while sleeping in her home because of a law enforcement hunch of suspicious activity. Social workers and psychologists have long reported home as the most dangerous place for women when nearly 3 in 10 women and 1 in 10 men have experienced abuse by an intimate partner within their lifetime. Thus, restricting movement and enforcing lockdown in the middle of a global crisis reveals increasing threats of violence and abuse in the home. In full recognition that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Breonna's story reveals that there are no safeguards against America's domestically violent assaults and multidimensional oppression facing Black women, even in the privacy of their own home. The politics of Black women and the politics of respectability, they fall apart when this young Black woman could not rest in peace before her life was taken in a botched attempt to seize narcotics that were never found. Home was the most dangerous place for this sleeping beauty who experienced intimate assaults of stalking, forced entry without consent, and injury to the point of death by police. Breonna's case raises significant questions about the value of Black life and the protection or lack thereof of Black women, particularly as Black feminists and womanists call for intersectional activism through counter movements such as Say Her Name in the quest for Black freedom. Unprecedented protests have spawned in Louisville and throughout the country as Breonna's story exposes there is no such thing as safe space for the vulnerable, even in their own home. Moreover, the recent, what I call no grand jury decision that offered more protection for apartment walls than Breonna Taylor, who suffered murder, raises questions for all of us. Where is justice in the case of Breonna Taylor? And how might people of faith cultivate a theology of liberation when home is a dangerous place? I want to thank our panelists for joining us tonight, and I am excited about this conversation as we delve deeply into an important topic. I want to begin with Hannah Drake, who is our on-the-ground activist there in Louisville. Hannah, can you tell us how has Breonna Taylor's case created new energy in activism and legislation, particularly in relation to the no-knock warrant?
First, thank you so much for having me. I think we were all, as you mentioned in your opening, that Breonna Taylor's death coincided with the shutdown of the nation because of the coronavirus. So for a while, her murder was just unknown to the general public. It wasn't until around the end of May that people really started paying attention. And they really, for me, started paying attention because her murder was couched in between the deaths of two men, Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. I think the murder of George Floyd certainly brought attention to Breonna Taylor, who was always going to have this uphill battle because she's Black and she's a woman. And so it was always going to be an uphill battle for Breonna Taylor to achieve any awareness and justice. And as we see, she didn't get justice in the end. But I think during this time of protesting, and people have been protesting over 100 days, typically protests start at an area in Louisville called Injustice Square Park, which has been occupied by various protesters that really continue to say Breonna's name. And what I have seen and what has excited me, and it's the first time in my life that I've seen so many various races protesting not just the death of Breonna Taylor, but the death of George Floyd, the death of Ahmaud Arbery, and just police brutality and racism. And I see a lot of young people protesting. Dr. McCormick and I were just at a march to the polls, and there were young people there, and it was the first time voting, period. So I think this certainly has ignited young people to say, we will not tolerate this any longer. My daughter is 24 years old, and she said she does not want her kids protesting about these very same things. And she started protesting with the death of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Sandra Bland. And here we are yet again protesting the death of Breonna and George and Ahmaud. And so I really feel that young people are energized. And one of the very first things we thought to do, we didn't know what to do, was to look at the warrant and why were they entering her home on a no-knock warrant, for what particular reason. At that particular time, Kenneth Walker was jailed for shooting at an officer, but Kenneth Walker was practicing the law, which is the castle doctrine here. And we thought there's no way you can have the castle doctrine, which is stand your ground, and no-knock warrants, because those two things are juxtaposed. And so we really started looking at the warrant and how they were able to enter Breonna Taylor's home. And our first thought was to change the warrant, to ban those type of warrants in Louisville. And Katora Heron, who works with the ACLU, was very instrumental in the language and the legislation to get no-knock warrants passed banning no-knock warrants in Louisville, and it passed our Metro Council unanimously. But even in that, I remember on that day, we were on the steps of Metro Hall and had the TV out and we were waiting on this vote. And I still cried after the vote came through because I knew that this was still on the back of a deceased Black woman. And it's always said Black women have to sacrifice or give up or be the canary in the coal mine for the rest of this nation to get justice. And so it was bittersweet for me that day to see that hopefully we will not have to deal with this again, that the police will enter someone's home on a no-knock warrant, but still at the expense of what? And sadly, this time it was at the expense of Breonna Taylor.
Yes, I can see. Thank you, Hannah, for sharing how the no-knock warrant is something that we have seen now happen in terms of Louisville, but it makes me think of all of the other countless cities, right? Particularly urban cities that are also in need of similar safeguards. I've been thinking about 2020 as this summer of reckoning in ways that we've seen, as we said in earlier conversations, the largest sustained kind of protest movement with BLM at its height this summer, particularly, and it has been through active embodied protests and demonstration. I'm thinking, Dr. McCormick, how has activism in Louisville on the ground awakened the Black radical tradition of protest? How can we see this along a continuum and not just some kind of novel or new particular case?
Sorry, I had to unmute. First of all, again, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's good to be with you, Reverend Jones, and to reconnect with you and to be here with my dear sister, Hannah Drake. Once you all told me Hannah was going to be a part of this, I knew I had to be here just, if nothing else, to sit back and listen to her brilliance. And so she has been an amazing voice here in our community. Hannah is a poet. We go back nearly 20 years to the church pews, and she has emerged as a poet and a powerful voice in our community, has been out in the streets and using her poetic voice, but also her prophetic voice, as have so many other Black women who have been on the front lines and at the forefront of this movement. And so we appreciate her leadership and the leadership of so many other Black women who have been in many ways the face of this movement, as it should be, right? In many ways, in the sense that they are protesting for another Black woman's life. And as it should be that those of us who are Black men and non-Black folks and non-Black women are following Black women's leadership, right? Because it has been important and it's been profound. So when she mentions Keturah Herron, when she mentions, or she has not mentioned someone like Attica Scott, who's a state representative who's also been fighting for Breonna's law, it's important to acknowledge Black women's leadership and here in Louisville and around the country in BLM and in this particular summer. And so once, as Hannah noted, that Breonna's case began to get more traction and more attention after George Floyd, and people began to pour into the streets because, again, you know, people had been quarantined inside. People were afraid really to come outside. No one wanted to be in contact with other folks and potentially contract the coronavirus. So the idea of coming out to protest was almost unthought of and unheard of. But I think it was the day that they released the recordings of Kenny Walker's police interview, where people actually heard Kenny Walker crying, right? And it was like, oh my God, Bree, oh my God, Bree. And he's, you know, talking to his mother and all of these other kind of things. And people were so outraged at what happened that the coronavirus, you know, became a secondary thought. And people poured into the streets. And what you saw there in those first couple of days in late May and early June were some very, very, very intense days where the emotions were raw and people were protesting and saying her name and calling for justice. But what I think we saw there was just a naked and raw display of state power. Right. In ways that we here in Louisville, right, we had seen in Ferguson, we had seen in Baltimore, we had seen in other places. It's not to say that Louisville is a stranger to state violence, but the responses that we were seeing in the midst of this pandemic and the kind of just theater of state power and the militarized police and the like, I think was so unnerving to so many people who had come out to peacefully protest, that I think a lot of young people, and particularly a lot of my students, I teach in the Black Studies department, a lot of our students who have been talking about a Black radical tradition and been talking about the 60s, or been talking about BLM and other places, who had gone out and they said, this is our chance to go out and be part of this movement, were met with such force, right? That it awakened something in them. And they said, we cannot believe that we come out here just to be peaceful, just to chant in the streets, and we're met with tear gas, we're met with rubber bullets, we're met with flashbangs, we're met with militarized police. And as the chant goes, why are you in riot gear? I don't see no riot here. And you saw so many people begin to be awakened to the workings of state power in a way that they just had not witnessed up close and personally. And I think it did radicalize a lot of people, a lot of students at the collegiate level, but a lot of high school students started to organize and have their own marches. And so we saw a lot of people doing a lot of community organizing, demonstrations, interventions. But as you talk about the Black radical tradition, it was certainly to bring a significant critique to bear upon white supremacy and anti-Black violence, but also on other systemic interlocking systems of power. So what we saw was the workings of capitalism. What we saw was the workings of sexism and patriarchy. What we saw was the workings of misogyny and so many other things that were happening, that people's critiques, I think, became more and more radicalized, right? And so they were finding, what interventions can we make? So we had people in the streets. We had people occupying Injustice Square, but we also had people who were doing other things when they were shutting down places and businesses in the cities, particularly in the Black neighborhoods of the West End. And no one could have access to food there because the Kroger had been shut down out of fear that Black people would go crazy and riot. Then we had people organizing for things like Black Market and Feed the West, because the West End is a food desert. We had other people who were figuring out how to combat gentrification in another part of the city called Nulu. We had other people finding out how to have radical read-ins and to have other ways of changing the public school system. And people were just finding their way. What is the intervention that I can make? Because they knew, as the protesters were saying, that, quote, the whole damn system is guilty as hell. So it was beyond that immediate encounter with the police. People became radicalized to know that if we're going to fight this system, we will be fighting it at multiple levels. And people knew that I can be in the streets, but maybe that's not the only lane for me. So Keturah and Attica are pushing legislation, and other people are doing food and housing and all kinds of issues. But we saw people really radicalize their critique and find their intervention.
Yeah, I'm thinking, about this kind of movement, counter movement, right? We talk about the ways in which there was this activism that emerged for Ahmaud Arbery and for George Floyd, and then this counter movement somewhat that emerges of Say Her Name, but also with Breonna Taylor, and then a kind of re-recognition that, wait a minute, Breonna Taylor, this story has happened since March 13th, right? Many people, this is not new, right? Many people are just realizing that this has been a struggle that has been for now exactly 7 months. Dana, we're so happy to have you as one of our students here at Union Presbyterian Seminary and a burgeoning womanist. And, I just want to ask you, frankly, how has the treatment and murder of Black women and girls been relegated to a secondary concern, right? That how do we miss the story of Breonna Taylor and it become only an aftermath conversation of what is seen as a larger conversation about, multi-pandemics in terms of coronavirus and what's happening against the assaults against Black life. It seems as if Breonna Taylor's story only came up as an aftermath or a secondary concern. Well, can you help us point to that in terms of how has this treatment and murder of Black women and girls been relegated?
Yes, I would like to start with, I saw an op-ed today submitted to the New York Times opinion by one of my favorite contemporary female rappers, Megan Thee Stallion. Mm-hmm. So I transcribed her video and I would like to lead with that. What does it mean to be a woman of color? She's got to be strong because that's just the expectation. Loving herself, but not too much because then she'd be too conceited. Being his lady in the streets, but then his freak in the streets. Inheriting her grandma's love, but always loving the wrong one. Being constantly told she's too much or not enough. Constantly having to prove that she's the victim because society always sides with the man. Not being able to express her trauma because she can't show weakness. Is constantly told that she's too dark, too thin, too thick, too much. Being murdered, beaten, abused. Being questioned if she invoked all of the violence against herself. Is left out on the street, but becomes the flower that grows from concrete. She marches for everyone else. She riots for everyone else. She dies for everyone else. She loves everyone else. She lives for everyone else. But when it comes down to her, ain't nobody in sight. Now I replaced some of her language to make it okay for tonight's webinar. But I'd like to give some context about where all of that comes from. That seemed to perfectly sum up my answer, but I'd like to give some context to where that answer comes from. Treatment and murder of Black women and girls has been relegated to a secondary concern because all of life has trained white people not to see us, has trained them not to see the brown Virgin Mary who bore the brown Jesus in us. Lisa Sharon Harper shares in the foreword of I Bring the Voices of My People by Shaniqua Walker Burns. She says that they've been trained not to see the laws and the structures that systematized the rape and exploitation of brown people's great-grandmothers' bodies for white male profit. They believe that because we don't see slavery in the form that it used to be today, that it no longer exists, when we know that that's the furthest from the truth. The new Jim Crow, as defined by Michelle Alexander in her book of the same name, is now the modern-day mass incarceration system. Carrie Day goes even further to define it in her book, Unfinished Business, the new Jane Crow, a legalized system that is creating a new caste structure among women of color, and particularly poor Black women, through the prison industrial complex. Black girls are the fastest growing population in the juvenile justice system today. And we see these extreme punishments in 6-year-old girls being handcuffed because they had a tantrum at school, or a 15-year-old girl who was sent to a juvenile facility for months during the middle of a pandemic because she did not do her homework, when she could not manage the medications that she was on because of the ADD that she had with an online platform now. Black women and Black women's bodies have been commodified resources for white-dominated structures since the beginning of time. We've seen it biblically in the story of the Egyptian slave Hagar, who had no rights of ownership over her own body and was forced into coerced surrogacy, which Dolores Williams tells us in Sisters in the Wilderness. We've seen it throughout history in the antebellum period, where slaveholders had this general notion that Blacks could withstand so much pain and that they could just take so much labor. And so Black women were expected to take and be subjected to so much more pain than white women were. Black women today are 2 to 6 times more likely to die from complication of pregnancy than white women, reports the Journal of Perinatal Education. And in 2019, according to the Human Rights Campaign, an astounding 91% of transgender or gender nonconforming people who were fatally shot were Black. So when we say that they've been trained not to see the laws and the structures, these are just a few of the examples of how these systems still play today. And in Michelle Alexander's book, Reva Siegel, a legal scholar, she's renamed this system where it's called preservation through transformation, where the systems of old have just been redefined for these current times. And in the ancestral voice of my grandmother, she would say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So we are still seeing it's been a historical thing that it's not that it's just now been relegated to a secondary matter of fact. It's just always been that way. They're trained not to see us. They're trained to not see the laws that are enabling these things to happen. And so that's where we've got to use our voices and the power of our voices through voting, through our activism to make change.
Thank you, Dana. Any conversation that brings in the savage star, Megan Thee Stallion, I'm here for it. So thank you for bringing in her words and so much of her own story, particularly this summer, right? And the experience of being fatally, shot, and experiencing that parallels in many ways to Breonna's story. I'm thinking about what I've been hearing even from Megan's SNL performance, as well as other kind of raising up of Malcolm X's quote, the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman, the most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. And this kind of claim to protect Black women, we hear that kind of coming up as a conversation, but then there's also this question about really the value of Black life. Right. And so I'm thinking, Dr. Sadler, where do we as humans reconcile a governmental system that uses, monetary consequences to compensate for the loss of life with a theology and tradition that valorizes and even sustains, if you will, in many ways, this sense that we ought to be treasuring life? How do we weigh in? Many people have been talking about, well, Breonna Taylor's family did receive a $12 million settlement. Is that justice? Is that enough? Right. And I'm interested to see theologically how we might reconcile these two extremes.
Well, Dr. Jones, thank you so much for that question. I think this is one of the key concerns that we have here. We start off with Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, that says that God created human beings, B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6 suggests that because we've been created in God's image, that we are all inherently valuable. If you take a life, there should be another life taken because of that. Human beings were deemed incredibly valuable in God's paradigm. We, standing in the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, should recognize to take.
Dr. Sadler, I think we're missing part of you.
Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. To take Breonna Taylor's life is to take something incredibly sacred, something that can't be replaced, something that you can't put a monetary value on. But it says something that's that's wrong in our larger system. In this particular instance, she was killed for the crime of passive blackness.
I think you're breaking up again.
She is. Okay. She is. I know. It keeps. She's responding to a crisis in her own home, and as a result of that, she's killed. What that says to me is that being Black in this country puts you at peril. Now, many people might say this is just a tragic mistake. It could have happened to anyone. The police could have broken in on any house, but they didn't. They broke into a house they knew was occupied by a Black woman. They broke into a house looking for a person who wasn't even there. And they did not take the due consideration. In many instances, it says they did not identify themselves as police.
Okay, I think Dr. Sadler, his internet may be.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't own a gun, but if I had a gun, I would likely have responded in kind to retaliate against someone coming in. The court system has demonstrated one of the major flaws in the way that we're viewed in America as Black and brown people. The life of Breonna Taylor was taken by these police officers, yet a crime that officer was charged with a crime by a grand jury. That officer was charged with the potential for violating the life of 3 white people that lived in an apartment away from her. What that says is that in America, being a Black person, having your life lost still does not provide a consequence. You can take a Black life and there is no consequence. No one goes to jail. No life is lost because of it. There is no in our larger theological system, we have to find a way that truly does honor and respect people's lives. And our system can only be called a just system if the compensation for the loss of a Black life is the same as the compensation for the loss of a white life, or the punitive nature of taking a Black life is the exact same for taking a white life. In this instance, until I think there is a true conviction of a crime for taking a Black life in the I'm not sure that police will take the consideration to be careful when moving into a Black person's apartment or stopping a Black person's car or wrestling with a Black person on the street. We have to have a consequence for the loss of Black life if we begin to change the larger equation in America about the human valuation. At the end of the day, I'd say the major problem is the issue of race. I say this at all points in time because the concept of race makes Black lives less valuable in America than white lives. As long as the concept of race persists in America, as long as Black lives can be valued at less of a rate than whites, as long as the consequence for the taking of a Black life is different from that for taking of a white life, we're going to continue to have these problems recurring. And I hate to say it, but Breonna Taylor's protest will not be the last one. And as much as I'm pleased to hear, thank you, Hannah, for the work that you did. Thank you for all of those who did great work to change the no-knock policies. We passed a similar law here in Charlotte just about a week ago. But in spite of that, that's not going to change what happened to Breonna Taylor from happening to another Black woman, Black man, or Black child in this country. It's going to take us finally dealing with the issue of race once and for all, saying that every human being in America is equally valuable, saying that the consequence for taking a Black life is the exact same as the taking of a white life. It's only at that point in time we will be able to make progress. I think that's the essence of what atonement might look like. To begin to shift policies and to shift procedures, but perhaps even more than that, to shift the way that people think and the way that people feel. We have to change hearts and minds to lift the value of Black lives in a very significant way if we are to have progress in America.
Thank you, Dr. Sattler. What I remember from one of Tamika Mallory's very poignant speeches a little bit after the grand jury decision on September 22nd is this kind of quote that Breonna Taylor is us, could be any one of us. And there is so much resonance, right, that we can see from any Black woman in relation to Breonna Taylor's case. I'm asking this as a general question, open to any panelists who'd like to weigh in for more as a conversation. But what does Breonna Taylor's case show us about the universal treatment towards Black women and girls in America?
If I can say for myself, it showed me that Black women really don't matter in this world. And it's sad to say, as a Black woman, I inherently knew that. But I remember sitting in Justice Square Park waiting to hear this announcement, that we had waited and waited. And it was if Attorney General Cameron held this city hostage. And we were always so anxious every single day. Is it going to be today? Is it going to be today? Is it going to be the next week? And finally, it was the day. And we were sitting there waiting. And they had it on the loudspeaker in Justice Square Park. And we were all gathered. And we heard wanton endangerment. And we realized it was like this slow realization across the group that it was not for Breonna Taylor, but it was for the wall of her neighbor. And I just started crying tears like I've not cried in a long time. Like I'm getting teary even going back to that moment, that I was so incredibly hurt as a Black woman that the wall got justice before she did, and that nobody would be held guilty. In all of our protests and all of the things Black women did in Louisville and in Kentucky and in this nation, and still there would be no justice. I felt as if this city truly did turn its back on Black women, and I've still not reconciled that. To live in this city and immediately cameras were in my face and the microphone. And what do we do now, Hannah? And I hadn't had a second to process any of this. And when you read Meg Thee Stallion's opening, I thought of my poem, Fix It, Black Girl. And it talks about fix it, Black girl. Teach us not to hate you, Black girl. And after that decision, I added a line, teach us how not to kill you in your home, Black girl. Because now Black women were forced to go on a press tour and now teach America how not to kill us and why our lives have value. And we didn't have a time to process what this state just said to us. Because now for the last, and I can't remember because we've been out in the streets and, you know, with COVID, every time is like non-essential now. If it's been a week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we've all been on panels and we've all been serving and we've all been now trying to teach the world, how does this not happen again? And I am literally at the point as a Black woman, what more can I tell you? What have Black women not done? We held up our end of the bargain. We've sacrificed. We've given, we have paid our debt in blood. We have given you our very children. And now you have the audacity as a white person to ask me, well, now how do we fix it, Hannah? You tell me how to fix it. Because everything I poured out to you clearly isn't working. Something isn't clicking in this city when a wall can get justice. And the embarrassment of it all is the Black neighbor's wall was shot into. And they didn't press charges for the Black neighbor's wall. So even in a wall, some drywall and paint, Black people get no justice. And as a Black woman, I'm torn because what have we not given this nation? We've given you our sons, we've given you our daughters, we've given you our husbands, we've given you our mothers, our aunts. You tell me, I can't fix this. I didn't create this. And it hurts that Black women don't even have a second to process the pain. Because now I have to teach you how not to kill me. I have to teach you how not to kill my daughter, and her name's Breonna. That's sad. And that's where we are in America.
I can certainly resonate that the terror, right, against Black women and girls is 400 plus years in the making. That transitions from chattel slavery to postbellum, right, even to contemporary stories that we hear now. Dr. McCormick, Dana, Dr. Sadler, any thoughts on this question?
Yes, I think going back to what Dr. McCormick spoke of about the capitalism of it all, and what Dr. Sadler said of the concept of the notion of race Our skin is just Black, but our human bodies are all made up the same. Black bodies, white bodies, we're all made up of the same thing. It's just that we may have been closer to the equator and our skin got darker. But it's this, America is just such a greedy country. And when you look at, and I've been studying this case about Breonna Taylor and watching documentaries about it. So to understand that that there's so much more at stake behind the scenes as to why her apartment was even selected and chosen, because there was 4 other properties that were chosen. It was a mass hit that was going down on the city on that day. And so her apartment was even the farthest away from the 4 clusters of apartments where they were trying to do some gentrification and gain that property and gain that land. So you have government corruption that's going on, and they were trying to seize drugs and push the poor people and the Black people out of that cluster of 4 houses that they were attacking that day, and hers being the farthest away, with the one association of her ex-boyfriend, who they already had in custody. So it's so much that is behind the scenes, and police breaking and busting in with these no-knock warrants and stealing monies in these raids and things of that notion. So you have government corruption, you have police corruption, that's all behind it. So to use the value of a wall as a reason why, they will backflip, double dutch, and do whatever else they have to justify the legality of the deaths of our people by their police, which is why they are so intent on law and order, And so justice for Breonna Taylor is nothing because she's not here. Justice would be Breonna Taylor being here. And so right now, the justice that we have to seek for her is what the work of what Hannah is doing. The activism is the communal justice that we get, where we can change laws and we can change policies. It is judicial justice, where we use the power of our voices in voting to get the right people in office, to write the legislation that we need written in the language that we need it written in. We have to use the policies and things that we can today to find justice on behalf of Breonna Taylor, because there is not going to be justice for her because she's no longer here. So we have to do it on behalf of her. Her voice was taken. Her vote was taken on the day that she was killed. And so who are we not to go out on election day to try to get these people out of the office and vote in the people that we need in office that are going to work on our behalf and on behalf of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Sandra Bland? Say all of their names.
Amen. Thank you for your comments. And we can see on exhibit tonight great Black women's brilliance, and it's wonderful to be able to recognize that we're not talking about, in the loss of Breonna Taylor, the loss of something insignificant. We're talking about the loss of someone very significant. I don't know if you all were able to hear me when I was opining about the notion of race a few minutes ago. We've got to begin to shift in that way if we're going to make the kinds of progress that we need to make in the overall fight against what happened to Breonna Taylor. We also have to begin to say that it's time to hold the federal government, it's time to hold state and local governments accountable in a different sense. We can't get justice, as Dana said quite eloquently. We can't get justice for Breonna, but we might be able to protect the next Breonna. We might be able to protect a woman in the future if we can change this larger notion of the way that we view Black and brown bodies now. If we can begin to shift in the valuation. I think this is a pregnant moment. In the aftermath of this summer, we've seen so many different things happen. We've seen COVID-19 take so many Black and brown bodies at disproportionately high rates. We've heard what others have called COVID-16-19 take others. So we're talking about Ahmaud Arbery, we're talking about George Floyd, we're talking about Breonna Taylor, now in a way that we wouldn't have talked about it maybe 2-3 years ago. 2 things I want to say is, one, I hope that we utilize this as a moment to say, never again, never allow this to happen again. Let's make legitimate shifts in the way that we view people so that we can avoid this. And I hope that we also say, we're not going to stop until we see something change. So many times in the past, we've seen these things occur. We've seen these types of abuses take place. We've seen police, state violence threaten the lives of Black and brown people. But nothing changes. And we come out, we protest, we do what we're supposed to do, we try to make a change, and nothing legitimately happens that will change the lives and livelihoods of Black and brown people. Well, this time we can't stop until something does legitimately change. I remember a few years ago, after the killing of Jonathan Ferrell here in the state of North Carolina, after a large fight, the Attorney General of the state of North Carolina, Roy Cooper, who's now our governor, tried Officer Randall Carrick, who killed Jonathan Ferrell, was not able to get a conviction, got a hung jury, and then said he couldn't do anything. We took a group of ministers out to go meet with him and say, you know, what's going on? A hung jury is not a decided jury, Reverend Dr. Barber said in that instance. We need a decision in this case. After talking with us for a while, he said something that is completely disturbing to me and continues to haunt me to this day. He said, I've looked across the state of North Carolina, and I've tried in many different contexts to find a jury to be able to hold Randall Carrick guilty. I know he's guilty. We all know he's guilty. But I could not find a jury in the state of North Carolina that would convict Officer Randall Carrick. This is what race does. It makes Black and brown lives seem irrelevant. It means that we can live in a life that a world in which there is no consequence for the taking of our lives. This is what needs to shift. The way that we ultimately not only develop policies, but the way that we as human beings think, until we can valorize human lives, Black and brown human lives in all of our perspectives, until we can get juries that will convict officers like the one who came in and fired 6 shots, 5 of which hit Breonna Taylor and killed her. Until we can find such juries, we're going to be having these conversations. I'm frustrated to say.
Dr. McCormick, did you want to weigh in?
Well, listen, I don't want to follow all that. Hannah said enough for all of us, and Dana followed that up, and then Dr. Sadler has certainly waxed eloquently. I don't have much to say, except for, and I really do think, this case tells us something about the persistent vulnerability of Black women's lives. Obviously, vulnerability to state-sponsored violence and policing, to be sure, but also in the domestic front, right? And so for Dana having evoked Megan Thee Stallion, right? And to say that for all that we're talking about the state-sponsored violence, that Black women's lives remain vulnerable to multiple forms of violence, including at the hands of Black men, right? And then we need to have that conversation as well simultaneously as we're having the conversation about state-sponsored violence, because it is a conversation that I'm heartened to see so many brothers who have come out in the streets to speak up for Breonna Taylor and to wear our support Black women T-shirts and our protect Black women T-shirts and the like, right? But at the same time, when it comes to what happened to Megan Thee Stallion, right, make every excuse in the book about why Megan deserved to have been shot, right? And so we have this continuing vulnerability of Black women at the hands of multiple forms of patriarchal violence, right? The most egregious forms of which become manifested in state-sponsored violence by officers who aren't held accountable, right? But we need to talk about multiple forms of that, of the vulnerability. And as we talk about it in the context of the pandemic, we talk about the less glamorous or the less egregious kinds of violent acts, but also the vulnerability of Black women at the hands of doctors, right? And we've known that so many Black women's experiences are not taken seriously in the context of doctor's office, and have died of complications that should have been treated earlier on if Black women's narratives had been taken seriously. My spouse works in the public school system, and so people have said, as law enforcement officers are to Black men, or as white men are to law enforcement, so are white women teachers, right? The kind of analog to white policemen, and the work that white women and other teachers do in the school systems. And when you look at the documentary Push Out and the ways that Black girls are policed in the school system, right, and are more likely to be expelled, more likely to receive excessive punishment, or to even be punished by force at the hands of resource officers and the like. I mean, there are so many ways that Black girls and women's lives remain vulnerable to many forms of violence, but also not only the vulnerability, but the disposability. I mean, it's that they're vulnerable and the violence happens and it simply doesn't matter. So that even before you get to the failure to bring justice at the level of the grand jury, when you looked at the police report that LMPD filed, right, that there was a almost literally blank police report. So that when the questions were asked about what happened, who were the victims, everything was left blank. It was as though nothing had happened. Breonna Taylor's life was erased from the police report way prior to it was ever erased from the grand jury decision, right? So the fact that it was just completely erased tells us something about the disposability, or in academic speak, the fungibility of Black lives and Black women's lives in particular. But I also want to say it tells us something. I think in this moment, this case tells us something about the capability of Black women's lives as well, as Hannah bears witness to, and so many Black women activists and Black women leaders who have shown us, how to fight. And again, it's a disproportionate burden, right? So Hannah speaks to this well, that we have to now show you how not to kill us. But Black women have been very capable in leading this movement and to leading the legislative changes and the like. And I think that's been very, very important. So that ironically, even as Breonna Taylor's life was perhaps secondary, or her story only came to light after we talked about Ahmaud Arbery and after we talked about George Floyd, I would argue that her name has become the name of the movement this summer. I would argue that there is no one more talked about than Breonna, from Oprah Winfrey lending her support to the NBA, to the WNBA, to Tobe and Weijay, to Bryson Tiller, to all of these names. I mean, we talk about George Floyd, but Breonna's name has become the most significant name of the movement right now. And I think that is because of the work of Black women who have forced us to say her name.
I am inviting folks to give questions from the floor that you have from the comments, from the chats. And I see Richard Boyce has asked this. The Presbyterian Study Catechism interprets the commandment against murder as follows. Quote, murder or injury can be done not only by direct violence, but also by an angry word or a clever plan. And not only by individual, but also by unjust social institutions. The seminary is a social institution. How should it battle against injustice regarding the murder of Black women's bodies? I'm going to ask Dr. Sadler if he'd weigh in on this one.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that the seminary has a great role to play. If we are a thought shaper, if we are a organ of a larger sense of morality that is born in Christ, then we've got something to say about this. We need to step up and make sure that the larger community is paying attention, that we can't let this go. Dare I say that part of our job as the seminary is to frame this as a theological concern, to say that there's a biblical implication for the taking of Breonna Taylor's life, that we as Christian community, whether we're Black church or white church, whether we are poor or wealthy, we can't ignore it. We've got to do something about it. We have to make this heard. There should not be a Sunday that goes by in the midst of this crisis that does not have someone in the pulpit mentioning what took place about Breonna Taylor and saying that we've got to do something about it. Just a second ago, my daughter walked down and she came down here to get something to eat for dinner. I looked at her, a 17-year-old African-American girl, beautiful, never done anything wrong, wants to contribute to society in so many different ways. And the fearful thing that I have is that her life could be taken and no one would be held responsible, that no one would care at an official level, at a state level. Three of the women that are on this screen right now live with that same threat on a regular basis. We as Christian community, and dare I say, we as seminary, need to make sure that that changes. This should be something that is near and dear to our heart, something that we begin to work on. And I don't know, what does working on this look like? Maybe it means that we spend some time in our education programs educating about the value of Black lives. Maybe it means that we spend some time utilizing the social capital that the members of our congregations have to begin to shift policies and procedures in our city council and on our police departments. Maybe it means that we go to the state level and to the federal level to make sure that we begin to change laws. And of course, at the end of the day, I'm going to say we need national truth and reconciliation work to begin to shift the way that we deal with race as Americans altogether. The church has a responsibility to play, and we as a seminary have a role to play in this work. If we are the intellectual backbone of the Christian church in America, then we've got to stand up and say, this is what thus says the Lord we must do in this moment.
Thank you.
Just quickly, if I could build on that, if just quickly, I mean, Dr. Sadler mentioned having a 17-year-old daughter. I have a 14-year-old daughter who is a very fiery young Black woman who has no problem speaking her mind. She is a young womanist in the making, Reverend Jones, for sure. And you know, one of the things that, again, as my wife is an educator, what we see happening in educational spaces, whether it's the seminary or it's the public school, is the violence that is directed at Black girls and women. And so Bettina Love, in her book, We Want to Do More Than Just Survive, talks about what she calls soul murder that happens in the classroom. Right, when Black women and girls' stories are discounted, when their narratives are are not included in the curriculum, when they are taught to believe damaging reports about themselves and to hate themselves as young Black women and girls, whether it's intentional or not. It's something beyond just educational malpractice that Dr. Love names it as a kind of soul murder, right? And I think that has a kind of theological implication. I think that happens in the public school classroom. I think it happens in the seminary classroom. So at the level of the seminary, and I too teach at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, as well as the University of Louisville, I think that we need to take womanist theology seriously. I think it needs not to be an elective course. I think it needs to be something that is central to the curriculum and how we restructure the curriculum. How can we not be talking about womanist theology and feminist pedagogies in a moment when we're talking seriously about Say Her Name? You can't talk about Say Her Name in the streets and not say her name on the curriculum, on the syllabus, in the classroom. And when we say her name, that is empowering, right, to young African-American girls and women, but it also says something to those of us Black men and non-Black folk in general about the significance as Black women as intellectual producers, right, and whose experiences are worth taking seriously at the intellectual and academic level, right, and that there is theological significance about Black women's lives. And let me just end with this, and I'll say this because, and I'm giving a lot of deference to Hannah because I want the sister to know I love her. But when she was out in the streets, I was watching her live stream on probably a couple of weeks ago when you all were marching and the police had cut you off and flashbangs and so on and so forth, and you all were rerouting and going back to Injustice Square. Now you cussed a lot in there. You cussed a lot in there, and it was justified. But there was a moment when you started speaking, and it almost gave me chills because you were talking about the conversation going back there after you given everything that you had to this city, you know, and how they had treated you in response. And you talked about, I had a conversation with my daughter, Breonna, and I told her, I'm 44, but you still got a lot to live for. And then you started talking Bible, and you started talking Christological. Right. And you said, because at this point in the movement, no one takes my life. I lay it down. And when you said that, you had said something Christological and profound. It was a kind of womanist Christology to say something about your salvific role or redemptive role in the movement and what you were doing and what people like you are doing that needs to be taken seriously at the theological level. So that students need to be studying what is Hannah Drake doing and what is the theological significance of that? What is Stachelle Bussey doing and what is the theological significance of that? What is Tamika Mallory doing and what's the theological significance of that? So what our Black women are doing in this movement is not just something that they're out here and shaking fists and speaking loudly, but it is of theological significance and it's something that we need to take seriously in our classrooms.
Absolutely. Womanism as a discourse, right, takes seriously the experiences of Black women, and particularly in theological education, pairs that and parallels Black women's experiences in conversation with our theological formation as well as biblical interpretation. When I think of Breonna Taylor, I think of a text of terror for sure, right? This is a Jephthah's daughter, a Tamar's rape case, right? These are similar Hagar's story, right? These narratives, these, as Phyllis Trible calls texts of terror, parallel in many ways who is killed in their own home, right? This is terror. This is American terror, and certainly a story that reveals to us ways in which we might be able to use Breonna's story as a parallel to our own biblical and theological stories that we learn from as well. I see another question emerging from our conversations here. Sam Ziegler asks, how can we correct the disproportionate burden change-making places on Black women? How can we correct the disproportionate burden that change-making places on Black women? Dana? Or Hannah? I see Hannah's just joined us. How can we correct this?
Am I unmuted?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think we can do absolutely is that's where the allyship and the co-conspiratorship comes in. The burden doesn't just solely rely on us. It takes, we want help. We need the help. And so for others who are non-Black or others who are different than us to come on board and to lend a hand and to say, how can we help? And not only just how can we help, but take that back to their communities so that they can share the wealth of knowledge of what we need so that they can help us also. So, you know, people are always asking, well, how can I help? Well, what can I do? And Dr. McCormick, I think, spoke of this earlier. There's so many different ways of activism. You know, you don't have to be on the front line per se. There are food banks, there are clothing needs, there are bailout funds that need to be had for people who can't make bail, who are getting arrested, who are on the front lines. There is your social media platform. Share the information across your social media platform. So to just come and say only, how can I help? But you want to do it secretly and not put it out there publicly that you are doing the work in some type of way, that's not beneficial to us. So in order to help us, use your social media platform, use your public platform, use your voices to go into your churches and demand change. Go into your own social communities and demand change. And risk, and with this work comes risk. There's going to be some loss. You're going to lose some friends. You're going to lose some church members. You're going to lose some family members probably, but that's what it's going to take in order for us to get to the next level of where we need to be to. So the burden doesn't have to always lie solely on us. We want the assistance. We want the help. We want to have numbers, as many as possible, to help us in the fight and the plight. But we just need for you all to step up and not step up in the ways that you're comfortable with and the ways that you're used to. If you're going to help, this is what we need, and this is what we need you to do.
Yeah. I see in the comments that Dr. Phyllis Shepherd said, show up every place, right? This sense that we need allies who are willing, advocates who are willing to take the same level of risk, right? And to show up and to place their bodies on the line in many ways, in ways that Black women's bodies are already on battlefields.
Yeah, man. If I could just weigh in and say one thing, one of the things that might be helpful is if white churches could begin to express a shift in their own understanding of Black women's lives. So I don't know how many white churches I've been in, with the only Black women I ever see that have come through that church are the women who are working in the nursery or the women who are cleaning up the church. But they're not sitting in the pulpit. They're not running the church, not sitting on the session. Why don't we try to nurture Black leadership in white spaces? Because I think that
I think Dr. Sattler has cut out again for us, but Hannah, we're welcoming you back again.
Thank you. I'm sorry we had some technological difficulties.
No problem. I think this question is particularly generated from your lament in many ways
Right.
concerning with this sense that our bodies are already on the line, and then you want more, right? You want me to teach you now how to redress or to reform a system that is already right terrorizing to us. And so Sam has asked us, how can we correct the disproportionate burden that this change making takes on Black women as well?
Don't place the burden on Black women. It really is just that simple, right? Place the burden on white people. Black women and Black people, but since we're talking about Black women in particular, didn't create this burden. White people created this burden. So if white people want to do something about it, then fix it. It really is just that simple. When I talk to white people and they ask me, what is it? Can I do? And I don't, and they always seem so confused, right? And did I freeze? I'm frozen, I think.
No, you're here.
Okay.
We hear you.
So I think you always start inwardly. Any change will always start inwardly, and then it spreads outwardly. So
I think you froze. So what I hear Hannah saying, and I'm going to hope that she comes back in because I want to really hear it, is that this kind of this sin of white supremacy, or the sin of even racism, right, not only needs just reconciliation, it needs repair, right? It needs, right, these other repentance, right? It needs these other systems in place before we move towards restoration. I'm going to invite our folks who are joining us to add questions that you might have for our panelists who are on. And thank you all for staying on with us even throughout the technical difficulties. I think this conversation is so rich, and invite any of the panelists also to jump in on the conversation if there's something that you wanted us to bring out on tonight's conversation.
Yeah, Dr. Melanie, I'd like to add that, I think this moment in time right now is requiring us to use what, as womanists, we call our sanctified imaginations. And it's up to our churches to enable our congregations to use their imaginations to imagine a society that we have never seen before. To see a society where someone's race is not held against them is a society that we've never seen before. So this is something that we have to create ourselves. And in our futuristic minds, I can see that, but we have to be able to imagine that and be given the permission and allow the permission and the space to imagine that. So that means inviting uncomfortable conversations and having these uncomfortable conversations and the realities of, like Hannah said, of going inward, because the change starts from within. So we have to work on ourselves from within first before we can just start to, a Black person and a white person come on the stage and shake hands and now we're all happy and reconciled. That's not what racial reconciliation is about. It's got to be deeper than that. So I think as Dr. Boyce asked, what can the seminary do? What can institutions do? I think just by enabling people to use their imaginations to envision a world that is raceless, that does not rely on distinguishing these race classes that society, constructed itself for its own gain and its own benefit. If we can imagine that, then that's a goal that we can work towards.
I see a question from Amy Symes asking, how do we frame this as a theological concern to those churches that don't want to hear it? And I'm assuming this is the violence against Black women and girls. How do we frame this as a theological concern to those churches that don't want to hear it?
I think this can go back to that earlier question about what is the role that the seminary plays. If we are playing the role of a leader in this regard, we can begin to shape this such that we can understand the significance. Womanist theology needs to be at the forefront of this, shaping the significance of Black women's lives, making sure that we recognize that this is something that God has a major concern about. and then utilizing this as something that gets into the church. But the problem is we've been lifting this concern with the church for so many years now, and it doesn't seem as though it's made any significant change. We've talked about issues of race before, and it doesn't seem like the larger church in America has gotten behind it. Matter of fact, in the last election, the evangelical population of the United States overwhelmingly voted for a man who's got significant racial problems and significantly problematic understanding of race in America as part of his own self-understanding of the country. The church has got to take responsibility for its own moral stance, and the church has got to be able to stand up and say that all lives really are important, and we can't say that all lives really are important until we recognize that Black lives are important, and we can't say that Black lives are important until we recognize that Black female lives are important. This has got to be the mantra of the church until something does finally shift. So if we as the seminary begin to lead in this regard, and we frame this in a way as to give the church something to teach, give the church something to work with, then maybe the church will finally get on board answering a question that it's been asked for more than 401 years now in this country.
I see a question from the floor again from Sam asking, James Baldwin writes that white Americans are unable to recognize the grievances and oppression of others because, quote, they cannot face what this says about themselves and their country. How might we shift people beyond this stage of denial, as well as shifting people beyond their fear of what happens when the system is not weighted in their favor? Hannah or Dr. McCormick? I know we missed Hannah's in part, and we really want to hear from you.
I actually wrote about this called The 10 Stages of Facing Racism. And denial was, I believe it was one of the first or second stages. And when I was driving one day and thinking about what was going on in our city. This was even before Breonna Taylor. And I said that facing racism is like the stages of grief. There are various stages that people will go through. I believe denial may be the first stage. And so typically I can tell where someone is in this continuum of denial and acceptance and deflection and all of the different steps. But they simply just have to face it. America is really good now saying, well, this is not who we are. And then I'm like, well, then who is it? Like, who is it if this isn't you? These are the crimes against humanity that America or white people has done to Black people and people of color, and not just in America, across this world. And you simply have to face it and own it. There is no other way. And I tell people, so I don't have a doctorate in theology at all, but I tell people the Bible says, yea, though I walk through the valley, right? It's not yea, though I go over it, or yea, though I go under it, or yea, though I go around it. This is simply something you are going to have to go through. And what gets me with many people is they think it's going to feel good. Who said it's going to feel good? Who promised you that? In fact, I can promise you that it's not going to feel good, because you're going to have to face things about yourself that you think, oh, that's not me. I would have voted for Obama a third time if he was on the ballot. But in fact, it is you. I wrote an article called, in fact, Karen is you. You think Karen isn't you because you have Black friends and your kids hang out with Black kids, and I know the Black neighbor, but Karen is in fact you. And until they face that realization, looking in the mirror, we will never get to the other side of it. And the only way to get through it is to face it. That's the only way we will ever deal with this. Pretending you don't see color, denying that racism exists. None of these things will ever get us there. White people simply need to face white people. That's the solution. And it's not going to feel good. And there will be no cookies. There is not going to be a trophy. You don't get a sticker at the end of this. You get to say that you're treating Black people like humans, period. That's the prize.
Sam adds to this question. Might faith be a way in which we find strength to move beyond fear? I'm thinking here, what comes to mind here for me is the faith of Black women in terms of what Emily Town says, spirituality as social witness. That faith is what Black women have used in order to survive these terrorizing systems, and has been a source of strength, right? If we look at a Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth, right? And countless Black women who have been up against or in the face of danger or violence, right, have used faith as a part of their weaponry or their toolkit, if you will, in order to fight against the systems, what Dolores Williams calls, this is demonarchy. There is spiritual wickedness in high places, that this fight against this violence that we are engaging is something that we may need faith to contend with. Dr. McCormick, might faith be a way in which we find strength to move beyond fear?
Well, certainly faith is always a resource to move against fear. And as you speak, that Black people's faith has been a significant resource to buoy us up and give us the strength to fight on. But I'd also like to, at the risk of being contrary, to suggest that doubt for white folks might be a more important resource to find that strength. So when in the vice presidential debate, the moderator asked Mike Pence about Breonna Taylor, his response was, well, it's tragic what happened to Breonna Taylor, but I have faith in the American judicial system, right? And it's where white folks' faith is placed that becomes so problematic, that white folks' faith becomes placed in the systems that have always served them well and murdered everyone else. That's why the White House comes out with a statement about Christopher Columbus, right? And the origin narratives that it wants to tell about the United States. And it has faith in the goodness and the good intentions and the explorations of Christopher Columbus. Never mind the fact that it meant the genocide of Native Americans. So that a healthy and holy sense of doubt in the standard narratives that have been told about this country and that have been told about the morality of whiteness. Because when we go back to Baldwin, and what Baldwin would suggest is that part of the fear is what we have to face about what white people have to face about themselves. And Baldwin talks about white people as moral monsters, right? And what does it mean to face yourself as a moral monster and to doubt the goodness that you've always been told about yourself? And particularly white women. And, you know, I want to tread into that lightly, but I want to tread into it really, right? As we talk about that decision about Breonna Taylor coming down on the same day that the denial of justice came down about Emmett Till, right? And the white women who had propped up that story about Emmett Till, right? And white women's, you know, kind of purity and goodness and so on and so forth. So these narratives that have been told about white folks and about white women that have been so easily believed because everything in society conspires to make that narrative the definitive narrative, that there's something about doubt, right? And the faithfulness of doubt of these definitive narratives about whiteness might be something that gives white folks strength to face the realities of what people of color are experiencing in this country, and then a different kind of faith learned from the experiences of Black folk, and particularly Black women who have been on the underside and had to cultivate a very different kind of faith, right? That is the kind of faith that Solange Knowles talks about when she talks about Black faith still can't be washed away, not even in these Florida waters, right? As she sings on the soundtrack of that Queen and Slim soundtrack, because there's something about Black faith that has had to withstand all of the doubts about our humanity and about our monstrosity, right? That we've had to disbelieve and have faith that we are in fact made in the image of God, that we are in fact worthy to be loved, that we are in fact somebody, right? That's a different kind of faith. And so doubt in the kind of faith in American goodness and the goodness and the purity of whiteness and white womanhood and all of these kinds of things then can lead to an encounter with a different kind of faith that might in fact be a different type of source. But that faith of Black folk got to be taken seriously. That's why I mean you got to take womanist theology seriously. That's why I mean you got to take Black theology seriously. It can't just be the kind of addendum to the standard faith account that is articulated by Karl Barth, that is articulated by the kind of real theologians, right? That are supposed to be the canon of the theological encyclopedia.
Jocelyn Shipman asked a question to that point. How do we deconstruct the works of a Reinhold Niebuhr, right, who was one of the most influential white Christian theologians of his time, but also demonstrated the manner in which Christians could worship God while at the same time ignore the violations of Black bodies? I'm thinking most particularly of James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which he carves out for us a kind of privilege, ignorance, or dismissal, right, of what was happening in Harlem in that time, but also with Black life in the streets, and a kind of esoteric white theological imagination that is forming in the seminary halls when there's a total different reality that is happening in the street. So how do we, deconstruct this in ways that we've seen our high white theologians, or those who are part of the classics, how they have also dismissed Black bodies even in their works? Dr. Sadler, I'm going to pick on you with that question.
That's an interesting question. And dare I say right now, I'm a biblical scholar, not a theologian. So this is dangerous territory for me to wade into. Perhaps there's a significance to recognizing that we have to, listen to alternative voices as we think about theological lenses. We have to make sure that we are hearing from the people who have been dehumanized and pushed to the sidelines. One of the things that is most important, I try to lift up in my classes on exegesis, is that we've got to begin to listen to other people's voices than just those standard white male voices. Now, granted, Reinhold Niebuhr is a white male voice that I want to listen to, because he did begin to challenge this larger notion of the way that the white church was responding to Black oppression in America. Of course, the best rejoinder to that would have been, as you already lifted up, James Cone in all of his works, from Black theology to The Cross and the Lynching Tree. The best rejoinder to that, and the sort of response to the positive direction I think that Niebuhr was trying to get us to move into, was sort of that Cone work. I think we need to also begin to reimagine theology. I've seen a little bit in the chat so far today, a little bit of conversation about, we have to talk about the fact that Jesus was Black. We have to talk about the fact that that Jesus's mother was Black. And this might sound insignificant, but I think that the way that we have framed theology in America in a way that privileges whiteness, that places whiteness next to God in terms of divinity, that has sort of perpetuated this inability to see dignity, to see divinity, to see God expressed in Black forms, and in this conversation, Black female form. I think that we as the church have a responsibility to reimagine our theological lens. I want to use that term that Dana used earlier, to reimagine our theological lenses, so that we might see that God might be hiding behind the very face of Black and brown bodies in this country, the faces that the white church has for too long ignored, the faces that the white church has for too long. And I'm sorry for saying it this way, but you can't be a student of someone like Frederick Douglass and not realize that the church has been complicit in the racialization of America for far too long. The church that we are in today is a direct descendant of that church, and it's never repented for it, and it's never shifted in fundamental ways its base theology. We've got to reimagine a theology that is more consistent, not only with a Black Christ, as Kelly Brown Douglas might say it, but more consistent with a reality that that not just human dignity, but divinity lies in Black and brown skin.
Quickly, yeah. If I may, is that okay? Dr. Sadler mentioned the Black Mother of Jesus and Black. I mean, so I'm wearing this shirt tonight, right? Mary, the mother of Ferguson, right? With Black Mary with her hands up, don't shoot, and Jesus, there as the Christ child who is vulnerable to police violence. And so, it's a powerful image that came out, the iconography that came out of the Ferguson movement. But it also suggests that is a kind of theological statement from below. Which is to say, for me, that we are so invested in theology, capital T, theology from above, which is the kind of standard theological text. But all kinds of people are theologizing and engaged in God talk. And so where are those other kinds of alternative theological voices coming from? And do we listen to them? And do we pay attention to them? Sometimes it's coming from the streets. Sometimes it's coming from Black women's voices and narratives and literary. I mean, womanist theologians are telling us all the time. I think about, Common, the hip hop artist who just off the cuff rhymes. I was rolling around in my car the other day and it occurred. What if God was a her? Would I treat it the same? Would I still be running the game? Right. And so he goes into this whole theological musing about how much would dramatically shift in his own life if he had to imagine God as woman. Right. That's the same thing that's happening in the young people who are wearing the T-shirts to the protest that said, I met God, she's Black. Right. And it seems like a kind of trivial thing and just a kind of popular cultural thing. But these young people are theologizing. And it was no coincidence for me that people were wearing these T-shirts to Black Lives Matters protests, because it was a fundamental shift. And I always use that example in my classes. And I ask my students, in my Black studies classes, what has to happen? What has to shift? What is actually the sociological statement being made and the theological statement being made if we have to imagine God as Black woman? It changes fundamentally how we think about the hierarchies that we build in society. It shifts everything. And it's not to say that we have to think about these in ontological terms and literally imagine God as Black. But if we do imagine God as a Black woman, it really does shift the way that we have to think about everything else about how we order society. But these are theologies that are coming up from below, but we don't take them seriously because they don't come with the same kind of academic pedigree, right, as we are taught to believe is the important theology, capital T, that we learn in seminary. And I think we really have to reconsider what we mean by theologies pluralized, as opposed to theology as the standard narrative that's come down from the white men from Germany and Switzerland and the ivory towers of the United States.
We have been just so empowered tonight by our conversation. And I just want to make space for a final go around. Gail Henderson Belcito asks, hearing all of what we have heard tonight concerning Breonna Taylor's case, the injustice that she endured and that we as Black women have endured, where do we place our faith? Where do we place our hope? Perhaps a Kingian question, where do we go from here as we think about Breonna Taylor on our mind and remembering that her life still matters? Any final thoughts from our panelists?
I think for myself, I understand that the work that I'm doing it for generations that will simply come after me. I think, MLK said, I may not get there with you. I've been to the promised land and I won't get there with you. I may not get there. And in fact, he didn't get there. And we're still fighting today. So I understand when people ask me about this fight, I garden. And I tell people all the time, there are different roles when you garden. And my brother-in-law tilled the ground and I planted the seeds. Some days my daughter waters the garden. Other days, I had a young group of kids give me a tomato plant to put in my garden, and people have enjoyed those plants that those kids will never see. And so we all have these different roles, and we need to understand this certainly will be a long fight. And we are planting seeds that maybe somebody else will water, and somebody else will dig up the weeds and deal with the mess, and somebody else will enjoy the harvest. And I encourage people to find out where you fit into that process. You may do them all, or you may do just one, but I don't feel saddened when I water the garden, knowing that somebody else is going to enjoy the harvest. I am happy because I know somebody else is going to enjoy the harvest. And that's how I look at fighting for justice.
Dana?
Yes, this season of holy disruption, as I heard Reverend Ken Fuquay call it, has definitely emblazoned a fire within me. It has empowered my voice and my womanism, my activism, and I wholeheartedly agree with Hannah that the work that we're doing now, even though we may not see it in our generation, it is for generations to come. Those from the civil rights movement knew that they may not see the benefits of their work, but they still did the work. And so we are tasked to still do the work today, to plant those seeds so that the future generations, that our children won't have to deal with these same situations. And so that's why it is so important to use the validity of our vote, of our votes, to get out on election day, to get active in whatever kind of way that you can. Everybody's not going to be on the front line. Choose one thing to be active in and be well at that, and use that and maximize that. So I agree wholeheartedly with Hannah. I will continue this fight. I will learn as much as I can to be as best and as active as I can to make policy changes so that this does not happen to another. I will try to lead by as much example as I possibly can with my own personal life. And I expect others to hold me accountable to that. We are responsible for holding one another accountable when we fall short. In love, we are. And so if I fall short, or if I see anyone else falling short, I'm going to hold you accountable. And I expect you to do the same for me and for all of us.
Thank you. Dr. McCormick?
Well, I don't really have too much to add to all of that. You all talked about faith and futurity, and I think it is about the future, and we're fighting for future generations. And so I just talked about a kind of low theology, lowercase t. And so I think about the theology of that brilliant series, Lovecraft Country. In this most recent episode where they time travel back to 1921 in the Tulsa riots. And and Jussie Smollett's character is standing there with who would be her great, or Tick's great grandmother, and explains to her what is happening in the future, and that what happens in this moment will have consequences for her great grandson. And she gets it, and she says, well, my great grandson will be my faith made flesh. Right. And she's willing to engage in those actions. I'll try not to spoil the episode if you haven't seen it yet. But she talks about what I'm doing right now in this moment has implications, and that my great grandson will be my faith made flesh. And so there's things that we're doing right now, I think, that have something to do with our faith being made flesh in our great grandchildren's lifetimes, that again, they won't have to fight these same fights with these demons and the demonarchy that is trying to steal our lives. And so we engage in that fight for futurity.
Thank you. Dr. Sattler?
Thank
I think Dr. Sattler's having some connectivity. Oh.
I think our faith should be placed in our God, of course, our God.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. We've had a brilliant conversation with brilliant folks. And I hope that all of tonight's listeners and folks who tuned in were able to glean something. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Dr. McCormick. Thank you, Dr. Sattler. I appreciate your presence and your gifts that you've offered to us. This series will continue into November. Our next conversation, November 10th, again at 7 p.m. Eastern, will be on race and the 2020 elections, particularly dealing with America as the Democratic Project, or the United States as a Democratic Project. And we'll be having Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, Dr. Stacey Floyd Thomas, Dr. Rachel Bard, Sam Ziegler, and Dr. Rodney Sattler, who'll be joining us as panelists. We hope that you will continue to join us. And just to remind all of you that we are 7 months since Breonna Taylor was killed in her home. Say her name, Breonna Taylor. Her life matters. It still matters for generations that are now and for generations that are next. Thank you again for attending this broadcast, and we hope to see you again in November. Good night. Take care.